Hey everyone, this is Libertarian Black Man. Black Americans should be libertarians, and I'm going to show you why. Libertarian philosophy opposes attempts by government to create a perfect society because libertarians understand that all attempts inevitably lead to the degradation of society, and that has shown itself in two ways. One way is the widening of the racial gap between blacks and whites in multiple areas, and the diminishing level of economic progress among black Americans over the last several decades. Anyone can look up information about trends in racial attitudes. Here's information published by the University of Illinois. And what it shows is a disconnect between what people think is going on and what is actually going on. So in this chart that talks about explanations of inequality and shows African American respondents, this green line represents the percentage of blacks who believe that discrimination is the reason for the inequality between blacks and whites. And seeing that the line is above this 50% threshold for the past several decades, it shows that for many years blacks, a majority of them, believe discrimination is the reason for why they are not achieving as much as whites. This is wrong. In fact, racial attitudes over the past several generations have been improving. The green, yellow, and blue lines represent improvements in white attitudes toward school integration, represented by the green line, and interracial marriage, represented by the yellow and blue line. Now, they're all going up over the past several years because of the improvement in white attitudes toward integration with people of the African American ethnic group. So this chart represents explanations of inequality among white respondents. This red line represents the percentage of the white community who believes that it's a lack of motivation on the part of blacks that is responsible for them not achieving as much as whites. Once again, this line for the past several decades is above the 50% level, meaning a majority of whites believe blacks are just less motivated to work as hard as whites and achieve as much. This is also wrong because the data shows, going back to the 1970s, that the number of working hours that both races are working is the same. Looking at 1979, white people on average put in 1,700 hours a year at work. For blacks at that time, it was 1,600 hours. In 2015, whites put in about 1,900 hours, and blacks put in about a little more than 1,800 hours working per year. Statistically, no different. So there is no proof to show that blacks are actually working less hard or less often than whites, and therefore less motivated to achieve as much. There's no proof showing that. So the idea that more discrimination by whites is driving racial inequality is wrong. The idea that it's less motivation on the part of blacks to work that's driving inequality is also wrong. The real answer is regulation by government, and in particular policies that govern working in the first place. So if we look at unemployment rates, we'll notice that there's actually a difference between how unemployment used to be and how it is today. This document put out by Ohio University researchers Richard Vedder and Lowell Galloway shows that from 1890 to 1930, the non-white unemployment rate seemed not to be materially different than the white rate. They get their information from the U.S. Census Bureau. They publish reports at the beginning of every decade. This is the actual census document from 1890 that shows the labor force participation rate between blacks and whites. On this page of that document, you'll see that this page shows the male population ages 10 and over working. Total white. This row represents the total white population in the labor force, 84% in 1890. Go down to the bottom where it says total colored, 87% of blacks were in the labor force in 1890. 84 for whites, 87 for blacks. Statistically, no different. Actually, slightly more for blacks. Blacks were less likely to be unemployed, but statistically not different. Over here, this is females, ages 10 and over, in the workforce. And 12% of white females ages 10 and over were in the workforce in 1890. 39% of black females were in the workforce. So black females were actually likely to work in the workforce compared to whites by 2 to 1. So the unemployment rate was actually lower for blacks than for whites during this time period. And that has been true not just in 1890, but in every decade up until the 1930s. This is kind of a hard chart to see the colors on, but these top two lines represent black and white males. The two lines are on top of each other from 1890 to 1930, which means that the unemployment rate, the labor force participation rate of African Americans and whites ages 31 to 40, were the same all the way from 1890 to 1930, and then a gap opens up showing that whites are more likely to be employed than blacks. Here, this line here represents black females, and then this line down here represents white females. There's a gap, but that gap starts to close during the 20th century. So what is explaining the fact that the gap has opened up between black and white males where there was no gap, and where the gap used to exist between black and white females is now starting to close up halfway through the century? What is causing this? Minimum wage laws have come in during the 1930s. The Davis-Bacon Act of 1931 and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 introduced national minimum wage laws that made lower-skilled labor more expensive and therefore less likely to be employed. Unfortunately, this hurt black people the most because they were less likely to be skilled compared to whites, being denied educational opportunities and so on. So their unemployment rate starts to open up and become much higher than whites starting in the 1930s. Also, the Supreme Court stopped enforcing the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was being used to strike down minimum wage laws in the early 20th century when they were first introduced at the state level. During the 1930s, the labor movement gained power and influenced the Supreme Court to stop enforcing the 14th Amendment. And so we ended up with more state-level minimum wage laws that came into existence that helped to widen the unemployment gap between blacks and whites. Unfortunately, black people are more likely than whites and Latinos and Asians to support raising the minimum wage. In this chart, support for a $12 minimum wage is highest among blacks, even though raising the minimum wage and even having a minimum wage in the first place hurts blacks more than all these other racial groups, because blacks are far more likely to be low-skilled than all these other racial groups. If we look at marriage rates, we're going to see the same thing. A time when we had a smaller gap between whites and blacks, and then a time when the gap starts to open up. This blue line connecting with the purple line here represents non-marital birth rates of blacks, and it was below 20% in 1940. Today it's over 70%. The red line here connecting with the green line represents non-marital birth rates between of the white community. 1940 was around maybe 3%. Today it is 30%, a little under 30%. But still, the outcome is worse for blacks because a vast majority of blacks are now born outside of marriage and without a two-parent income household. For whites, that rate has also increased, but it is under 30%. We have hurt blacks far more with what happened in the 1960s than whites when it came to marriage. And that is the government assistance programs. So Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, that's the food stamp program. Aid to Families of Dependent Children, AFDC, that's the straight cash welfare program. Women's, Infants, and Children, WIC. And dozens of other welfare programs were introduced in the 1960s. And if we were to take a look at when the gap began opening up the most, it's during the 1960s and 70s, where the gap stayed basically consistent, but we start to see a widening of the gap starting in the 60s, late 60s, and it continued all the way to this day. If we look at racial representation in the population and welfare statistics during the 2010s, we have disproportionalities. 70% of the population was white, 12% black, but yet we have underrepresentation of whites in all these programs. 60% in the WIC program, 43% in Medicaid, 36% in SNAP, 28% in the TANF, which is the AFDC program. Underrepresented for whites, overrepresented for blacks. 19% in WIC, 18% in Medicaid, 25% in SNAP, 19% in TANF. They're overrepresented in welfare, meaning they are more dependent on welfare, more likely to be on welfare, and more likely to be incentivized not to get married to have children because the government comes in and pays for their children without a man being present and not being needed. Unfortunately, again, blacks are more likely to support government intervention in housing, in jobs, in schools, and other accommodations. These solid color lines, green, red, blue, yellow solid lines, represent black attitudes toward government intervention in the economy, and they're all above 50%. A vast majority for several decades support government intervention. It's the intervention that has widened the gap between illegitimate birth rates between them and whites, and has widened the unemployment rate between them and whites. Poverty rates. Also, blacks are coming out of poverty at a slower rate. In 1940, 87% of them were in poverty. In 1960, it was only 47%, a drop of 2.3% per year. They're coming out of poverty at a rate of 2.3% per year between the 40s and the 60s. In 2010, the black poverty rate was down to 24%, but that meant a drop of only 0.9% per year for the previous 50 years. So they're coming out of poverty at a slower rate, starting in 1960 with the introduction of other welfare programs that made poverty easier for them and incentivized them less to come out of poverty. And the growth of government also has slowed down economic growth, slowed down investment, heavier taxes, increasingly complex tax code, more regulations on business, greater levels of inflation from excess spending. All of these things raise the cost of living, raise the poverty level, and make it more difficult for people to come out of poverty because their income now has to rise even more in order for them to stay out of poverty. If we look at proprietorship rates among blacks, we're also noticing a decline in the number of black businesses. This is an article by The Atlantic published a couple years ago. Where have all the black businesses gone? Well, they've been kicked out of the market by excess government regulation. In that article, you see the number of black-owned banks nationwide was 60 in 1985, 23 in 2017, a drop of 62%. We look at black-owned insurance firms nationwide. 50 of them in the 1980s were in America. 2 of them in the 2010s, a drop of 95%. We're killing black business because of excess government regulation, taxation, and inflation, which just makes it more expensive to start a business, start a bank, start an insurance company. Unfortunately, over 90% of black Americans support Democratic pro-government candidates for political offices, and the remaining support Republicans who are also pro-government in a different way. They are voting for and financially supporting politicians who are against their interests. Black libertarians are so rare they don't even register a fraction of a percent of the vote in any national poll for any office. So this is the crisis that black Americans face. They're not supporting the people who believe in what is best for them, and they are supporting those who do not believe what is best for them. So here is my advice to black Americans. Educate yourself about the issues. Read books and watch interviews by Dr. Thomas Sowell, Dr. Walter Williams, and other libertarian philosophers to learn about economics, history, and why you should embrace the principles of smaller government and free market capitalism. Also, purchase my book, Say No to Big Government, My Case for Maximum Freedom, which I talk about these issues and why the government is not your friend, but is your enemy when it comes to trying to help you. This book is on Amazon for $18. The best thing you can do is to stop supporting Democrats and Republicans and start supporting libertarians with your money and your vote in 2020. The next election is around the corner. Be prepared and go for what is in your best interest. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel and Twitter page, Libertarian Black Man, and we'll